Hey everybody. This is the introduction to Raya Dunayevskaya's Intersectional Marxism, Race, Class, Gender, and the Dialectics of Liberation, edited by Kevin B. Anderson, Kieran Durkin, Heather A. Brown. This book was published in what year? Recently, right? 2003 or something like that. The hell? I can't find it. 2021, actually. The contents of this book, I'm going to read the stuff at the beginning. There's an introduction, Kevin B. Anderson, Kieran Durkin, and Heather A. Brown. Part 1, Hegel and Dialectics. Chapter 2, Raya Dunayevskaya's Concept of Dialectic by Peter Hudis and Kevin B. Anderson. Chapter 3, Unchaining the Dialectic on the Threshold of Revolution, Dunayevskaya's Discovery of Hegel and the Birth of Marxist Humanism. 4, The Indispensability of Philosophy and the Struggle to Develop an Alternative to Capitalism by Peter Hudis. The chapter before that, the Unchaining the Dialectic, was by Alessandra Spano. Part 2 of the book is titled Gender, Race, and Revolution. Chapter 5, Raya Dunayevskaya's Marx by Adrian Rich. Chapter 6, Women as Force and Reason, Dunayevskaya, Marx, and Revolutionary Subjectivity by Heather A. Brown. Chapter 7, Raya Dunayevskaya on Race Resistance and Revolutionary Humanism by Ndindi Kitonga. Chapter 8 is titled The Dialectic in Marxism and Freedom for Today, the Unity of Theory and Practice and the Movement of Today's Concrete Struggles by Lilia Di Manso. Part 3 of the book is titled Connections and Debates. Chapter 9 is titled Marxism and Freedom, apropos of Raya Dunayevskaya's book by Rodolfo Mondolfo. I think that might be a reprint because I think Rodolfo Mondolfo was like a mid-20th century Marxist, like a contemporary of Dunayevskaya, so I don't think he would be writing in 2021. Part 3 of the book is titled Connection... Wait, I already said that. Chapter 10 is titled Why 21st Century Marxism Has to Be Humanist by Paul Mason. Chapter 11, On Capital Accumulation, the Tendential Fall in the Rate of Profit and Crisis Theory by Karl Ludenhoff. Chapter 12, The Revolutionary Travels of Marxism and Freedom by David Black. Part 4 of the book is titled Freedom and Liberation. Chapter 13 is titled Why Marx is More Relevant Than Ever in the Age of Automation by Paul Mason. 14, Raya Dunayevskaya's Emancipatory Marxism. Frédéric Montferrand, I'm not sure. Chapter 15, Beyond Anti-Humanism, Alienation, Praxis, and the Dialectics of Liberation by Kieran Durkin. Chapter 16, Two Kinds of Subjectivity in Marxism and Freedom, Hegel, Marx, and the Maoist Detour by Kevin B. Anderson. And I'll read the notes on the contributors. Kevin B. Anderson is professor of sociology at University of California, Santa Barbara, with courtesy appointments in feminist studies and political science. Kevin B. Anderson is author of the book Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism, 1995, Foucault and the Iranian Revolution with Janet Afari, 2005, and Marx at the Margins, 2010/2016, among his edited volumes of the Rosa Luxemburg Reader with Peter Hudis, and the Dunayevskaya Marcuse Fromm correspondence, edited with Russell Rockwell in 2012. He also writes regularly for New Politics, the International Marxist Humanist, and Jacobin on Marxism and on international politics and radical movements in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. David Black, born 1950 in Newcastle upon Tyne, was educated at Rutherford Grammar School and Middlesex Polytechnic. Now resident in London, David Black works as a journalist, author, musician, and video maker. David Black's published books include co-authored with Chris Ford. 1939, The Chartist Insurrection, The Philosophical Roots of Anti-Capitalism, Essays on History, Culture, and Dialectical Thought. As editor, Red Republican, The Complete Annotated Works of Helen McFarlane, and Acid Outlaws, LSD, Counterculture, and Counter-Revolution. Heather A. Brown is an associate professor of political science at Westfield State University. Heather A. Brown has written widely on Marxism, feminism, and ecology, and is the author of Marx on Gender and the Family, a Critical Study. Kieran Durkin is Marie Sklodowska-Curie Global Fellow at University of York and former visiting scholar at University of California, Santa Barbara, which is where Kevin B. Anderson was associated, where he has been studying the Marxist humanist tradition. He is author of The Radical Humanism of Erich Fromm and co-edited with Joan Braun, Erich Fromm's Critical Theory, Hope, Humanism, and the Future. Peter Hudis is a professor of humanities and philosophy at Oakton Community College and author of the book Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism, a very good book, published in 2012. Frantz Fanon, Philosopher of the Barricades, published in 2015, and has published in numerous journals on international politics, Latin American social movements, critical race theory, and contemporary political and social philosophy. He co-edited the book The Power of Negativity, Selected Writings on the Dialectic in Hegel and Marx by Raya Dunayevskaya, and The Rosa Luxemburg Reader, as well as The Letters of Rosa Luxemburg. Hudis currently serves as general editor of The Complete Works of Luxemburg, a forthcoming 17-volume collection. He has edited Volume 1, Economic Writings 1, and co-edited Volume 2, Economic Writings 2, as well as Volumes 3 and 4, Political Writings 1 and 2. He is a member of the International Marxist Humanist Organization. Ndindi Kitanga is a Kenyan-American educator, longtime organizer, and activist in Los Angeles who has written on revolutionary critical pedagogy and democratic education. Karel Ludendorff is an Amsterdam-based labor activist and writer on Marx's critique of political economies whose essays have appeared in Logos and other journals. Paul Mason is an award-winning journalist, writer, filmmaker, and public speaker. Public Mason has written a number of books, including Post-Capitalism, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, and Clear Bright Future, A Radical Defense of the Human Being. Current work in development includes a short book about Karl Marx, a drama documentary about the Spanish Civil War, and the play Feel My Pulse. Rodolfo Mondolfo lived from 1877 to 1976 and was a prominent Italian philosopher and socialist humanist. Forced into exile under Mussolini's fascist regime, he lived subsequently in Argentina, where he continued to teach at the university level despite difficulties under the Peronist regime. He was the author of several books on Marx, Engels, and Gramsci, as well as ones on ancient Greek philosophy and on Rousseau, Hobbes, and Spinoza. Frédéric Montferrand was a PhD in philosophy from Nanterre University, France, and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Namur, Belgium. He wrote various articles on Marxism, and critical theory with Vincent Chanson and Alexis Cuquier. He co-edited Les Réifications, Histoire et Actualité d'un Concept Critique, which I'm guessing is Reification, History, and Actuality of a Critical Concept. I don't know. That's my guess. In 2014, and with Felix Boggio and Iwanji Epe, Stella Magliani, Belka Kem, and Morgane Mituil, he co-edited Pour un féminisme de la totalité, published in 2017. For a feminism of the totality. That's my guess of what that translates as. Frédéric Montferrand also co-wrote a Dictionnaire Marx with Juliette Farjat, and is currently preparing a book on the young Marx's critical ontology. Lilia Di Monzo is Associate Professor of Education in the College of Educational Studies at Chapman University. Lilia Di Monso engages a Marxist humanist revolutionary in critical pedagogy to develop a praxis for class struggle and the struggle against racism, sexism, and all forms of oppression that could lead to a socialist alternative and a, quote, new humanism. She is an active member of the International Marxist Humanist Organization and teaches classes on social movements. She has published significantly in academic journals, including Policy Futures in Education, Journal of Critical Education Policy Studies, Anthropology and Education Quarterly, Postcolonial Directions in Education, and in Alternative Public Pedagogy Sources, IMHO, International Marxist Humanist Organization Journal, and Truth Out. Lilia Di Monso is her latest book is titled A Revolutionary Subject: Pedagogy of Women of Color and Indigeneity. Adrienne Rich lived from 1929 to 2012 and was an American poet, essayist, and feminist. Alessandra Spano is a PhD candidate in political philosophy at the Department of Political and Social Sciences of Catania. Alessandro Spano received an MA in philosophy at the University of Bologna with a thesis focusing on the political thought of Raya Dunayevskaya. This research was the inspiration for a focus on Marxist feminism and critical theory, the concentration for her doctoral investigation, particularly looking at the United States as a political space that is simultaneously imperialist, quote, colonized, and global. Alessandro Spano's interests include Marxism, feminist theory, African American studies, German idealism, psychoanalysis, and radicalism in the United States. So there we are. Chapter 1, Introduction. Kevin B. Anderson, Kieran Durkin, and Heather A. Brown. Our present societal and intellectual landscape is marked by fear, disruption, and radical change. The political sinews that regulated and managed the global capitalist system after 1945, and which at first seemed to have been reinvigorated by the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989 to 1991, are fraying from NATO to the EU, in no small part the result of disastrous wars in the Middle East. At an economic level, the Great Recession of 2007 to 2008 wiped away the liberal claims to have solved the problems of stagnation that had doomed the earlier Keynesian economics, as the new economy revealed itself to be a house of cards. A decade later, the COVID-19 epidemic triggered an even deeper economic crisis while laying bare as never before the dehumanization of contemporary capitalism. Even in developed countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, central governments floundered in early 2020 while medical, delivery, food, grocery, janitorial, and other workers performed the dangerous labor that is really basic to social existence. Across the globe, hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives to the pandemic, while billions suffered wrenching economic privation. This was both a healthcare and an economic crisis, deeper than anything since the Great Depression. By late 2020, as society began to awaken from the first phase of COVID-19, the greatest mass movement in the U.S. since the 1960s broke out over the police murder of George Floyd, a semi-employed black man in Minneapolis. During this Black Lives Matter uprising, which spread across the country and internationally, hundreds of thousands of mainly young people demonstrated, occupied highways and streets, toppled statues of prominent racists, and attacked and looted luxury stores, burned at least one police station, and surrounded another while occupying the surrounding streets. The Trump administration met demonstrators outside the White House with repression so forceful that it backfired, with even military leaders being forced to distance themselves publicly from Trump, the most openly racist president in a century. Rubbed raw by mass unemployment, indebtedness, and lack of affordable housing, the new generation of youth faces a world it did not make, in a stance of resistance and of idealism in the finest sense of the word. More sensitive to sexism, heterosexism, and above all racism than any previous generation, they have followed the lead of black youth, swelling the Black Lives Matter movement into a massive challenge to the social order that shows no sign of abating. As Indini Kitonga, one of the contributors to this volume, intoned after participating in the first weeks of the uprising in Los Angeles, quote, "What we call for with regard to these curfews and the harassment is a questioning of where the money is coming from to fund this. The city does not run out of rubber bullets or tear gas. Yet as someone who does outreach to our unhoused people, I beg the city for personal protective equipment and shelter. I beg for food and unemployment compensation to help our people. There seems to be no resources to help people, but there are always resources to brutalize people. Something else I want to emphasize is that while this is, of course, an anti racist protest, it is also a working class uprising of people of all colors. This is also an anti capitalist uprising. It is a demand for people to stop being overcome by capital. The graffiti in Beverly Hills is not just, quote, fuck the police, but is also down with capitalism and down with white supremacy. We witness people connecting the dots, you see, end quote. In Indindi Kitonga. These are exactly the connections or intersections that were central to the life and work of Raya Dunayevskaya and that are at the heart of this book. Today, global capitalism is increasingly seen as the enemy of human flourishing, whether in its exploitation of labor, its environmental destruction, its virulent racism, or its continued threat of nuclear destruction. The new generation faces a life of precarity, underemployment, overwork for those employed, and indebtedness. Even strong proponents of the capitalist order see no way back toward the promised land of growth and prosperity. The concomitant crisis in thought and in wider society has led to neo-fascist and right-wing populist and nationalist forces coming to power in a number of countries, most notably the United States, Britain, Brazil, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, India, and the Philippines. Meanwhile, older authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia have tightened the screws on their populations, even as Australia burned and the Syrian people faced a final massacre by the Assad regime. But the crisis in the economic, political, and ecological spheres has also led to a resurgence of the left and a revolutionary opposition to systems of global dominance, as seen most dramatically in the 2011 to 2013 revolutions in the Middle East/North Africa region, MENA, the 2011 Occupy movement and early Black Lives Matter, as well as in electorally based movements like Syriza in Greece and those around Corbyn in the UK and Sanders in the US. In 2018 to 2020, grassroots radical activism returned with a vengeance with the Yellow Vests and the pension strikes in France, and most dramatically with the outbreak of what is being called the Second Arab Spring in Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Sudan also exhibited a deeper African dimension that resonated in both North and Sub-Saharan Africa. At an intellectual level, what the socialist tradition is called the, quote, battle of ideas, and quote, Marxist thought has also seen a resurgence, especially in the English-speaking world, putting postmodernism and the politics of difference on the defensive. Today's intellectual left is, broadly speaking, divided into two major streams. The first, often espousing some forms of Marxism, highlights capital and class, accusing the left of the 90s, and after of being stuck in what it disparages as, quote, identity politics. The second stream holds to focus on race, gender, and sexuality, attacking Marxists for a kind of class reductionism whose return they are shocked to see. Can a Marxist theory and practice, albeit one that is informed by intersectionality, dialectically transcend, aufheben, this contradiction? More specifically, can the theory and practice of the Marxist humanist and feminist philosopher, Raya Dunayevskaya, who lived from 1910 to 1987, help to overcome this contradiction within today's progressive left? Those are the issues that inspired the present volume. As someone who pioneered the rigorous class analysis of the Soviet Union as state capitalist and who early on critiqued Rosa Luxemburg's quasi-underconsumptionist economic theories as inadequate, Dunayevskaya was the rare Marxist thinker at home, as easy with arguments about declining profit rates in Volume 3 of Capital in relation to economic crisis as she was with Hegel, Dialectics, and the Young Marx. From Dunayevskaya's earliest days in the Communist Party youth group in Chicago in the late 1920s, she also fought for the centrality of race to an understanding of U.S. capitalism, subsequently working with C.L.R. James and Grace Lee Boggs in the 1940s and 1950s to critique class reductionist Marxism via a creative reading of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky. By the 1960s, Dunayevskaya had written profoundly on the African revolutions and their theorists, especially Frantz Fanon, also developing at this time concept of, quote, black masses as vanguard, end quote, of the American Revolution. By the 1970s, Dunayevskaya began to explore a new socialist feminism, here centering on a century of struggle as well as on key women Marxist theoreticians and their neglected feminist dimension, most notably Rosa Luxemburg. Her resulting 1982 book, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution, ran up against a certain indifference, if not outright rejection, in many quarters, including many feminist academics. A major exception was the acclaimed revolutionary feminist poet Adrienne Rich, who, nudged by the black revolutionary feminist Gloria Joseph, analyzed in depth the work of Raya Dunayevskaya in this period. In 1986, a year before Dunayevskaya's death, Adrienne Rich published a major retrospective on her in the Women's Review of Books that we are most glad to republish in this volume. While this helped to generate a wider discussion of Dunayevskaya in the 1980s/1990s, especially in the work of Margaret Randall on women and revolution, it did not succeed at that time in drawing the larger streams of feminist thought back to Marxism, let alone to Dunayevskaya's version of Marxist humanism. That missed juncture between revolutionary feminism and Dunayevskaya's Marxist humanism has inspired the title of this collection, Raya Dunayevskaya's Intersectional Marxism, which highlights the ways in which her writings intertwine issues of race, gender, and colonialism with those of capital, class, and globalization. But what was the nature of that missed juncture in the early 1980s? In that period, Dunayevskaya launched a multi-pronged effort to recast Marxism for an era that had experienced black insurgency, anti-war activism, and revolutionary feminism on a massive scale, even as the sharp turn to the right, later understood as, quote, neoliberalism, was beginning to form. Dunayevskaya did so via critical analysis of these revolutionary movements, but also through newly unearthed texts of Karl Marx and Rosa Luxemburg. This led to reconsiderations of the women's movement of the time, especially its African and African American dimensions, rethinking Marx in light of his late writings on gender and on revolution outside Europe, and a path-breaking analysis of Luxemburg that portrayed Luxemburg for the first time as a revolutionary feminist, in sharp contrast to almost all previous interpretations which had denied the imputation of feminism. Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution, sought to bring Marxist thought alive for a new generation that had come through the defeats of the 1960s movements and that embraced a worldview in which race and gender were as important as class. While Dunayevskaya did not use the term intersectionality, a term which did not come into wide use during her lifetime, she worked with a similar concept in her 1982 book as exemplified in this passage, quote, and just as the Sojourner Truths and Harriet Tubman's learned to separate from what they called their, quote, short-minded, and, quote, leaders who would not fight for women's suffrage in the, quote, Negro hour, end quote, of fighting for black male suffrage, so the new women's liberation movement arose from participation in the black freedom struggles of the 1960s, and the black women, in turn, made their own declaration, end quote. Dunayevskaya. It is this focus on both difference and commonality that is often missing in discussions of intersectionality. Certainly, the vastly different theories of intersectionality have offered important discussions of the need to take various differences in social positionality seriously, as this affects the ability of successful coalitions to form and for disempowered groups to claim their own power in progressive movements. However, difference can be best understood once there is a reference to a commonality that individuals can be measured against. For Dunayevskaya, who is committed to a Marxist humanist position, this commonality is our striving for greater freedom, for a new society that is free of structural impediments to individual and communal flourishing. This must be worked out philosophically and politically in a world where difference abounds and serves as a means to evaluate both one's own position and that of others relative to a vision of a better future that is possible. Thus, Dunayevskaya offers a positive vision of intersectionality which takes on common humanity, worked out through philosophical and political struggle, as a basis for unity rather than asserting already ossified differences and working in coalition from those distinctions. At the same time, she saw the struggles of black people and revolutionary feminists as a source of creative difference inside the radical movement. Black and feminist movements often constitute a real revolutionary vanguard, not only in action but also in thought, that the labor and socialist movements needed to learn from and sometimes follow. Moreover, at a theoretical level, these kinds of experiences needed to be incorporated into Marxist dialectical theory as seen in the concept of, quote, a movement from practice that is itself a form of theory, end quote, that undergirded Dunayevskaya's first book, Marxism and Freedom. In this sense, her notion of commonality involved facing these differences and the tensions they created head-on. It meant developing from them a notion of Marxist humanist commonality that was capacious enough to incorporate all these differing strands of thought and action. Unfortunately, the book Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution appeared during the retrenchments of the 1980s, when even many radical intellectuals were seduced by the timid social democracy of Jürgen Habermas or the ultimately disempowering post-structuralism of Michel Foucault. In 1992, in the wake of the implosion of the Soviet bloc, Richard Rorty, then considered a leading radical philosopher, intoned that, quote, large theoretical ways of finding out how to end injustice, end quote, as in Marx had failed the test of history, and that the left should strive for democracy, civil society, and the creation of wealth and a free market. Rorty concluded that no, quote, alternative to capitalism, end quote, existed, and went so far as to declare provocatively that, quote, the only hope for getting the money necessary to eliminate intolerable iniquities is to facilitate the activities of people like Henry Ford, and even Donald Trump, end quote. Exclamation point. Richard Rorty. In this period, many radical intellectuals embraced a postmodern or post-structuralist politics of difference, which also served to draw them away from Marxism of any kind, with its aspirations for class solidarities across national, gender, and racial lines. As 1960s icon Daniel Cohn-Bendit and Gilles Deleuze put it in 1987 in a classic statement of the politics of difference that pointedly left out capital and class, quote, the goal is what we call a culture of dissensus that strives for a deepening of individual positions and a re-singularization of individuals and human groups. What folly to proclaim that everyone, immigrants, feminists, rockers, regionalists, pacifists, ecologists, and hackers, should agree on a same vision of things! Exclamation point. We should not be aiming for a programmatic agreement that erases their differences, end quote. Cited in San Bonmatsu, 2004. And that's in a reference to John San Bonmatsu, 2004, The Postmodern Prince, Critical Theory, Left Strategy, and the Making of a New Political Subject. Anyway, these intellectual trends were conditioned by developments in global capitalism as Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II, and their implicit ally Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, were in the process of rolling back many of the gains of the 1960s. The bloody defeats of the Marxist-led revolutions in Nicaragua and Grenada and the transformation of the Iranian Revolution into a fundamentalist dictatorship helped to recast the 1980s as a period of retrogression. I don't know about Grenada, but in Nicaragua, that was definitely a Stalinist-led revolution. Which is like being bemoaned here, but if it was successful. I don't know what I'm talking about, never mind. All these accompanied the ushering in of neoliberalism, which Dunayevskaya at the time castigated as, quote, Reaganomics. Today, the historical and intellectual landscape has changed dramatically. Neoliberalism has been called widely into question, targeted by forces further to the right, like right-wing populism and nationalism, but also by a left that has been resurgent in both political and intellectual life. The politics of difference have emerged in the era of post-structuralism. The politics of difference that emerged in the era of post-structuralism has also receded. Both have been put on the defensive by the Great Recession and the rise of large global movements against economic exploitation and inequality. At the same time, a narrow politics of class and economic determinism has emerged with a vengeance on the left, seeing itself as the antidote to the politics of difference. I wonder if they're going to cite some examples of that. It is at this juncture that we invite the readers of this volume to consider Raya Dunayevskaya, philosopher, Marxist, humanist, feminist, anti-racist, activist, and revolutionary, as a thinker who is often out of joint with her times, but also who also speaks to ours with great resonance. A more specific and immediate impetus for the present book on the part of its living authors and editors, most of them long familiar with Dunayevskaya's life and work, lies in a series of talks and papers from the year 2018, the 60th anniversary of the publication of Raya Dunayevskaya's most influential book, Marxism and Freedom. Its original 1958 edition included in the appendix the first published English translation of major parts of Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts and Lenin's philosophical notebooks. The book based itself on an original reading of the work of Hegel, Marx, and Lenin, along with an analysis of the later stages of capitalism, monopoly, and state capitalism, and of popular revolution and resistance, from the French Revolution through the upheavals of our own day, like the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, and including the epochal Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956, whose revolutionary significance she discerned early on. I don't this is and if you I would highly recommend to anybody who's interested in this and questions this check out Paul Maddox's critique of Raya Dunayevskaya's Marxism Freedom. The Montgomery bus boycott was obviously of extreme importance and had class content, of course, and it was a very important and significant event. But to describe it as revolutionary in the sense of like anti-capitalist is very, very, very dubious, in my opinion, for what that's worth. But the book had been preceded by and was accompanied by nearly 2 decades of serious dialogue with several other revolutionary thinkers around the dialectic, race, and class, the heritage of Marxism, and the nature of contemporary capitalism, including the Stalinist, fascist, and democratic welfare state versions of state capitalism. Initially, these dialogues were with C.L.R. James and Grace Lee Boggs, her co-theorist in the Johnson-Forrest tendency, or the state capitalist tendency of 1941 to 1955. To this day, their philosophical correspondence of 1949 to 1951 remains unpublished, although joint works like State Capitalism and World Revolution and other individual works from each author have been acclaimed for decades. This is equally true of the writings of working-class militants associated with them, as in Dunayevskaya's comrade Charles Denby's book Indignant Heart, a Black Workers' Journal, an early edition of which appeared in 1952, or Grace Lee Boggs' comrade and spouse James Boggs' later work, The American Revolution, Pages from a Negro Worker's Notebook. Dunayevskaya's correspondence with Herbert Marcuse began in late 1954, just as the Johnson-Forrest tendency was splitting apart, with Dunayevskaya and Denby on the one side and C.L.R. James, Grace Lee Boggs, and James Boggs on the other. Dunayevskaya's long dialogue with Marcuse, much of it over Hegel, Marx, and Dialectics, took place between two kindred spirits, albeit with some major political and philosophical disagreements. Both were quite isolated during the McCarthyite 1950s. This correspondence, which dealt heavily on Dunayevskaya's side, with her concept of Hegel's absolute negativity as new beginning, had grown out of her 1953 Letters on Hegel's Absolutes, originally part of her correspondence with Grace Lee Boggs. These letters were later published numerous times in pamphlet form by Dunayevskaya, who considered this text her foundational statement on dialectics, the place where she began to make an original philosophical contribution. While Dunayevskaya never received a real response from Grace Lee Boggs or C.L.R. James to what was one of her last philosophical dialogues with them, in a certain sense she was able to renew this dialogue with Marcuse. Here too, though it was somewhat one-sided, with Marcuse never convinced of the revolutionary character of Hegel's absolutes, nor did they agree on the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which Dunayevskaya extolled as a creative form of working-class revolution, while Marcuse was more reticent, or on the consequences of automation for the working class. For an annotated edition of their correspondence, see Anderson and Rockwell. Marcuse wrote the preface to Marxism and Freedom and referred to the writings of Dunayevskaya's comrade Denby in his One-Dimensional Man. Shortly after, however, the correspondence broke off for several years after a heated dispute about Cuba's growing authoritarianism. Dunayevskaya moved in another direction, traveling to West Africa and forging ties with African socialist humanists. For Dunayevskaya, the correspondence with Marcuse was part of the development of what was to become her deepest study of the dialectic, philosophy, and revolution, from Hegel to Sartre and from Marx to Mao. There she argued that despite their multifaceted nature and mass participation, the radical movements of the 1960s had failed because a tendency towards spontaneism had blocked efforts to form a compelling and humanist philosophical vision of the future. This also clouded their strategic perspectives on issues like race and revolution in the U.S. Thus she chided Francis Cohn-Bendit for having downplayed the importance of theory during the French uprising of 1968. Yeah, and it's like, debatable to which degree that is true. Daniel Cohn-Bendit's, for instance, obsolete communism definitely um, had a politics to it that was very much derived, I think, historically from Socialissimo Barbarie, of course, Castoriadis, contributing to the book Facing Reality with James and Grace Lee Boggs in the late 1950s. So I'm not sure how anti-intellectual actually Cohn-Bendit actually was. Dunayevskaya similarly criticized the U.S. white New Left for its undialectical empiricism and pragmatism at a general level. To Dunayevskaya, this kind of pragmatism was exemplified in the New Left's plunge into the much more massive anti-Vietnam War movement in 1965 in such a way that left the black movement with the sense that their white allies had abandoned them. This is a highly original explanation of the rise of the Black Power movement and its separatist wing. Um, I think that I don't. Just a side note for myself, since I'm allowed to give opinions. To my understanding, the rise of Black Power had very much to do, for instance, like Malcolm X and say like the Nation of Islam and people of that sort had way more influence, I believe, in northern cities, because the um, the oppression of Black people in northern cities was obviously there was um, not an expert on it, but to my understanding, was way more they didn't in everyday life. The gains of the civil rights movement didn't really do much to improve the everyday lives of Black people in northern cities, which were made more afflicted by things like poverty and the things associated with that, police violence, and so on and so forth. So the kind of like economic aspects of racism were more palpable in northern cities, um, or like more like manifested themselves in a more evident manner, I guess this would be the best way to say it. And the power of the civil rights movement was due to like a coalition with liberal forces within the country. It wasn't just something that had been completely like on its own. It had to have like sympathetic ears um, within the establishment in order to have success. And this was like a liberal establishment that was kind of like supported by like a very conservative trade union movement. Um, that wasn't particularly activist at this point in its period, and coupled with the ongoing uh, poverty faced by many Black people, there wasn't the coalition to attack available to actually do anything about Black poverty, and so this is what the Black Power movement kind of emerged out of, this kind of like isolation and the inability to actually do anything significantly about wealth inequality and its racialized dimension um, in the early 1960s. I think also, and this is like and I feel like this is why like Black Power, which Black Power mostly like emphasizing as opposed to like the civil rights movement, which was very like integrationist, right? That was the kind of the dominant uh, um, conception of it that like won out. Um, Black Power focusing on like autonomy for Black people, some and having like different forms. A lot of people wanting like a separate Black nation or something like that. Um, but also like and it has like a right and a left, right? There's more socialistic aspects to the Black Power movement, and then um there's more like capitalistic elements, right? The emphasis on like Black business and like, I don't know, kind of more of a, what's the word, can't think of this guy's name, Booker T. Washington um kind of like more capitalistic uh vision of alleviating um the plight of Black people. um So I would be very skeptical about saying that the reason that Black Power came into existence was the abandonment of the New Left, um, of the civil rights movement, or something like that. Um, but that's just my shallow understanding of it. It also constituted a critique of the way Marxist groups with some influence over the anti-war movement, like the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party, had worked to keep the focus of the large national anti-Vietnam War marches on the single issue of the immediate withdrawal of all U.S. troops, even allying with liberal pragmatists to block proposals for the demonstrations to include slogans like "End Racism Now" alongside "Bring the Troops Home Now." As she honed philosophy and revolution during the 1960s, Dunayevskaya also examined more sympathetically the socialist humanist tendencies in Europe and Africa, visiting West Africa in 1962. Stalinist repression did not permit a trip to Eastern Europe of this sort. In both Eastern Europe and Africa, she found thinkers who had traveled the same road as she had, from the young Marx to a critique of contemporary forms of oppression and alienation. Among the thinkers she saw as the most creative, whom she contrasted what she saw as the weaknesses of Adorno and his negative dialectics, which tended towards the exclusion of the subject, were the Afro-Caribbean revolutionary theorist Franz Fanon and the Czech philosopher Karol Kosik. Or I think it might be Karl Kosik. I think it's my head pronounced it. I can't remember. Um, It was also in this period that her correspondence with Erich Fromm commenced. This began as Fromm was at work on his Marxist concept of man in 1961, the book that made the young Marx an indispensable part of the intellectual map of the English-speaking world for the first time. Fromm also invited Dunayevskaya to contribute to his widely circulated edited collection, Socialist Humanism. I don't know if I have Dunayevskaya's contribution on this channel, but I have most of the Socialist Humanism compendium on this channel. This book helped to give her work wider recognition, especially at an international level, putting her in closer touch with Eastern European Marxist humanists. It speaks volumes about the obstacles women thinkers faced in this period, even on the left. That Dunayevskaya was one of the only 2 women authors among 32 contributors. 8 years later, she was able to obtain a major publisher, Delacorte Press, for Philosophy and Revolution, for which Fromm later helped arrange the translations into Spanish, Mexico, and German, Austria. In the 1960s, as she was finishing Philosophy and Revolution, Dunayevskaya deepened her critiques of some of the newer trends in revolutionary Marxism, among them Maoism and Guevaraism, which she saw as having disoriented the movement and thereby abetting its defeat. Here, her principled stances cost her support on the left, especially among some of the youth she wanted to win over to Marxist humanism. For although many were breaking with the Soviet Union over its 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, in order to crush a democratic government with socialist humanist tendencies, Maoism and Guevarism retained support in many sectors of the New Left. If Russian Stalinism, with its heavy-handed, quote, dialectical materialism and, quote, scientific socialism, represented a kind of deterministic objectivism, Maoism and Guevarism illustrated for Dunayevskaya an equally serious obstacle to revolutionary dialectics, a form of voluntarism and hypersubjectivism. One second. Ba 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 ba. Anyway, never mind. Sorry. Philosophy and Revolution, which appeared in 1973 as the New Left was winding down, never achieved the impact of Marxism and freedom. Still, it increased Dunayevskaya's reputation as a serious dialectician and remained to this day one of the greatest contributions in this area. The book combined a deep engagement with Hegel, Marx, and Lenin, with searing critiques of Trotsky, Mao, and Sartre, along with a much more sympathetic philosophical political analysis in the final 3 chapters on the African revolutions, the East European anti-Stalinist ferment and revolts, and the black anti-war and women's liberation movements of the 1960s in the U.S. and France. Dunayevskaya delved once again into the dialectic in her last writings in the mid-1980s as she began to research a book tentatively titled Dialectics of Organization and Philosophy. Some of the draft material for this book was included in a posthumously published collection of her writings on dialectics titled The Power of Negativity, edited by Hudis and Anderson. By the late 1970s, By the late 1970s, Dunayevskaya was turning increasingly toward a critical analysis of revolutionary feminism in the U.S. Her new theorizing also took in the women's movement's emergence internationally at key junctures, like the 1979 Nicaraguan Revolution or the early stages of the Iranian Revolution during the same year, when feminists briefly took on the Islamists in an attempt to forestall their takeover. These radical movements and revolutionaries created a new context for Rosa Luxemburg's women's liberation and the book Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marx's Philosophy of Revolution. The book began with a strikingly new treatment of Rosa Luxemburg, placing feminist concerns at the center of her life and work for the first time in a way that has set the tone for discussions of Luxemburg ever since. But Dunayevskaya was no Luxemburgist. To be sure, in addition to appreciating her revolutionary feminism, Dunayevskaya extolled Luxemburg's attacks on reformism, her concept of spontaneity, her refusal to separate feminism from revolutionary Marxism, her deep commitment to anti-imperialism, and her commitment to revolutionary democracy, as seen in her critique of the one-party regime Lenin and Trotsky established after 1917. But at the same time, Dunayevskaya strongly criticized Luxemburg's move away from Marx's concept of crisis, her failure to support anti-imperialist movements, or the lack of engagement with the dialectic. Luxemburg definitely was an anti-imperialist, but she didn't view national self-determination as the solution to imperialism. And this is, I would say that Dunayevskaya definitely remained within the Leninist sphere in that regard, which is of course interesting because anti-imperialist movements or national liberation movements, just like leftist movements in general, do not necessarily have an emancipatory content to them. Um, um, like that's a very important thing, and also like national self determination, uh, might be and could be like a precondition for more individual freedom for human beings. Um, in terms of like if it's also coupled with like Republican forms, overthrows an ancien regime, but if it does not do that and instead replaces it with some form of Stalinist dictatorship or some kind of theocracy, such as in the Iranian Revolution, um, um, that is that's they remain anti-imperialist movements, but that doesn't mean that they're emancipatory. Right? Um, yeah, like if, for instance, in the Iranian Revolution, for instance, like just because you know Khomeini, a reactionary uh, through and through, doesn't mean he was not anti-imperialist, at least not anti-U.S. imperialism. Um, so just supporting anti-imperialist movements, regardless of like the political content of them, in my view at least, and this is just very, very big mistake. And it's like I feel like there's also like a fetishism, not fetishism, stupid word, but like a kind of like a romanticization that's probably a more uh, just to keep terms more clear. So it seems like a certain tendency among leftists, and maybe Dunayevskaya falls into this category, of just like uh, romanticization of the things that like failed, right? Like if many of these black nationalist, a lot of like the black nationalist movement, for instance, got any of the things they'd achieved, they like it almost necessarily would not. I believe personally would not have resolved itself in even um, uh, it would not have resolved itself in some kind of emancipatory way. But the fact that it lost, it deserves support. But if it won, it would have been a disaster. So, like, you know, uh, it's kind of like a weird thing where it's like, um, critique of the winner, not but in the absence of like critique of losers who, if they won, would not have furthered the goalpost towards anything remotely approaching communist freedom or bourgeois freedom, much less communist freedom. The last part of the book, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution on Marx, contained one of the first analyses of the new turn in his last years toward the global South and issues of gender and the family, all of it linked to his concept of, quote, revolution and permanence, end quote. In 4 chapters on Marx, Dunayevskaya also elaborated a critique of Engels, not so much for the usual reason first articulated by Georg Lukács, that his work exhibited a kind of scientific positivism. Instead, Dunayevskaya focused more on the new critique she had developed on the unilinear determinism of Engels' origin of the family, private property, and the state. Dunayevskaya contrasted Engels' treatments to the subtler dialectics she discerned in Marx's ethnological notebooks. The portion of these notebooks on anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan had actually inspired Engels' classic book. This critique of Engels led to the broader concept of, quote, post-Marx Marxism as pejorative, end quote, which included not only Engels but also Lenin, Trotsky, and Luxemburg. None of them, in Dunayevskaya's eyes, developed a fully dialectical version of Marxism. In addition, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marxist Philosophy of Revolution, featured 2 chapters on revolutionary feminism in the post-World War II period, with a focus on black feminism and on global revolutionary movements. It was amid this discussion that Dunayevskaya also brought to a point her analysis of Luxemburg as a revolutionary feminist who had to withstand determined but covert resistance on the part of her male colleagues to her assumption of a theoretical and political leadership position in the Marxist movement of the time. It is this book, and Women's Liberation and the Dialectics of Revolution, published in 1985, a collection of her essays that Dunayevskaya assembled a few years before her death, that formed the basis of our view that Dunayevskaya's Marxist humanism was an intersectional Marxism avant la lettre. But as discussed above, these 2 books appeared at a time when the feminist movement, whether in activist circles or academia, was turning away from Marxism and revolution. And in academia, by the 1980s, it should also be mentioned that gender studies were turning in many cases to an explicitly anti-Marxist philosophical perspective in the form of post-structuralism. However, as also discussed above, the worm had turned again, and with the upsurge of anti-capitalist left-wing radicalism in recent years, this is why Dunayevskaya's writings have become topical in new ways today. The present volume is divided into 4 parts. Part 1 is concerned with Dunayevskaya's engagement with Hegel and the notion of, quote, dialectics that stems from his philosophy. In Chapter 2, Anderson and Hudis offer an extended account of Dunayevskaya's engagement with the largely neglected Hegelian concept of absolute negativity, setting Dunayevskaya's engagement in the context of other Hegelian Marxist accounts, such as those of Lukács, Marcuse, and Adorno. They demonstrate the ways in which she developed the young Marx's appropriation of absolute negativity into a new interpretation of her own, whereby a positive arises from the negation in the form of a, quote, path to a new beginning, end quote, as a veritable force for liberation. Hudis and Anderson outline how Dunayevskaya's writings on Hegel and dialectics provide a new basis for developing a vision of the future, of totally new human relations, and of an end to the division between mental and manual labor, and of alienated gender relations, which can both animate and give direction to the emerging freedom struggles of our time. In Chapter 3, Alessandro Spano determines Dunayevskaya's development of her distinctive philosophy of Marxist humanism. Chanting charting her work as part of the Johnson Forest tendency through her 1940s analyses of Soviet economic policy, the break with Trotsky and the Workers' Party, and the development of the critique of state capitalism, and beyond. Spano pulls out the Hegelian threads that underlie Dunayevskaya's thought, dealing also with the split with C.L.R. James. Spano documents the way in which Dunayevskaya's philosophical, quote, breakthrough on Hegel's notion of the absolute paved the way for a new and distinctive dialectic of philosophy and organization that is premised upon assisting the autonomous organization of the working class against capital. In Chapter 4, Peter Hudis explores the indispensability of philosophy in Dunayevskaya's writings, drawing out the uniqueness of her position here vis-a-vis the divergent accounts of C.L.R. James and Grace Lee. Dunayevskaya's analysis of Hegel's notion of the absolute idea, Lenin's Hegel notebooks, and Marx's 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts are discussed, as is the later part of her career, in which she breaches the issue of philosophy and organization in a direct sense. Philosophy for Dunayevskaya is shown to be needed not just in order to grasp the roots of Marx's thought, but to reconstitute Marxism for realities that Marx himself never had to face, and notably for the challenge of articulating a communicable conception of a non-capitalist future that will fit the demands of the present. Part 2 is concerned with the centrality of race and gender in Dunayevskaya's thought and the revolutionary subjectivity contained therein. In Chapter 5, feminist poet Adrienne Rich explores Dunayevskaya's emphasis on the dual movement from theory to practice and from practice to theory, particularly as it relates to the women's liberation movement, which Dunayevskaya saw as both, quote, force and reason, unquote. Through a discussion of Marxism and freedom, philosophy and revolution, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marx's Philosophy of Revolution, and Women's Liberation and the Dialectics of Revolution, Adrienne Rich illustrates Dunayevskaya's unique practice of truly listening to the voices within the various social movements who are calling for and working to build a new concept of freedom. These voices had a profound influence on Dunayevskaya's lifelong work of reinterpreting Marx for her own time. In Chapter 6, Heather A. Brown offers a reading of late 20th century gender politics through Dunayevskaya's engagement with Marx and the historical events since his death that have demonstrated the need for an expanded and deepened understanding of the dialectics of history, focusing particularly on Dunayevskaya's utilization of Marx's notion of a, quote, revolution and permanence, end quote, which would abolish and transcend all exploitative relations. Brown details how women and non-traditional gender-conforming individuals throughout the world provide new avenues for inquiry as they say, quote, no to many of the most oppressive aspects of patriarchal capitalism, in turn providing the basis for building a truly inclusive, non-racist, non-sexist society. In Chapter 7, Ndindi Kitonga analyzes Dunayevskaya's theorization of the, quote, black dimension, end quote, in the U.S. and Africa as part of her wider framework of total liberation. As she delves deep into Dunayevskaya's engagement with the politics of racialization and the black self-development of subjectivity, including the struggles of U.S. blacks, the African independence movements of the late 1950s and 1960s, the black consciousness movement, abolitionist feminism, and the writings on Frantz Fanon. Kitonga demonstrates the nuanced ways in which Dunayevskaya was able to steer a path beyond the perils of class reductionism toward the creation of truly human foundations capable of realizing the unextinguishable desire to be free. In Chapter 8, Lilia Di Monzo explores the notion of revolutionary subjectivity as found in Dunayevskaya's writings, with reference to Dunayevskaya's extension of Marx's notion of the unity of idealism and materialism, and the dialectical relationship between practice and theory, and calling upon thinkers such as Paulo Freire, Rosa Luxemburg, Frantz Fanon, and Gloria E. Anzaldúa. Monzo demonstrates how such a subjectivity is embodied in the leading role of women in movements as diverse as Black Lives Matter, the Zapatistas, Rojava, and Idle No More. These movements, with their embodiment of subjectivity and objectivity, are presented as a model of the kind of intersectional revolutionary politics that Dunayevskaya actively championed in her time. Part 3 looks at the life and work of Dunayevskaya as considered in connection with the notable 20th century figures and movements, thereby documenting the wider influence and reach of her work. In Chapter 9, Rodolfo Mondolfo places Dunayevskaya's humanist reading of Marx in the context of the Italian publication of Marxism and Freedom in the early 1960s, noting that the thematic similarities with the writings of Marx, Rousseau, Hegel, Fromm, and Lenin, among others. On the basis of this discussion, Mondolfo proceeds to draw out the central concern with freedom that enlivened the major revolts of the time. From the workers' movement in East Germany in June 1953 to Russian political prisoners' revolt in the forced labor camps of Vorkuta in July 1953, to the workers' insurrection in Budapest and in Hungary as a whole in October 1956, and the retroactive critique provided by it to the deformation of Bolshevism in the USSR, thereby showing Dunayevskaya to be keenly attuned to the pulse of history. In Chapter 10, Paul Mason develops an account of the humanism of Marx's writings vis-a-vis the major debates on 20th century Marxism. Using the work of Dunayevskaya as a grounding, Mason discusses the epistemological debates that characterized the Second International, the anti-humanist debates of the post-war period, and the debates over automation that mark the present day. What results is a novel thesis whereby an appeal is made for a moral philosophy that dovetails with a reconstituted Marxist theory of knowledge and a provisional anthropology of the species to act as the basis of a projected transition beyond capitalism. In Chapter 11, Karl Ludendorff contrasts Dunayevskaya's and Luxemburg's respective accounts of Marx's theory of the nature of capitalist crises through a detailed elaboration of Dunayevskaya's interpretation of the law of the tendential decline in the rate of profit. Ludendorff demonstrates how Marx's account, enlivened by its humanist attention to the subjectivity of the voices from below, consists of a new unity of economics, philosophy, and revolution, disclosing the different forms of revolt that reveal the logical development of the system to the point where no alteration in exchange or distribution could fundamentally change anything. Contrasted with Luxemburg's theory, whereby the cause of capitalist crisis lies in a deficiency of demand, Dunayevskaya's theory reaches beyond economic analysis to the impulse of new forces and passions in the dialectical movement of society. In Chapter 12, David Black charts Dunayevskaya's revolutionary travels in Britain and Europe following the publication of Marxism and Freedom. In a revealing insight into this period in her life and into the wider left at the time, Black draws on upon hitherto unpublished correspondence, along with reviews of her work in the period, to paint a picture of Dunayevskaya as in dialogue, at times critical with leading leftist figures such as Tony Cliff, Honorato Dalman, and Cornelius Castoriadis. Black also unearths a history of movement building with the spread of Dunayevskaya's philosophy and practice of Marxist humanism in England and Scotland via the notable worker intellectual figures of Frank Williams and Harry McShane and the leading figures of the African Forum. In Part 4 is concerned with exploring the themes of freedom and liberation that enliven Dunayevskaya's writings. In Chapter 13, Paul Mason contextualizes Dunayevskaya's Marxist humanism, placing it in relation to the Marxism of her contemporaries and fellow radicals Leon Trotsky, Frida Kahlo, who went on to become a Stalinist after. That's not something that's always talked about, is that Kahlo did not remain a Trotskyist after Trotsky's death. She, in fact, at least to my understanding, double check what I'm saying, but to my understanding, she went back to the mainstream of communist movement, the Stalinist movement. And Natalia Sadova-Trotsky, obviously there's the famous picture of Natalia Sadova-Trotsky together with Raya Dunayevskaya. Mason charts the biographical and political interrelations between these four figures as a set against the interpretation of Marxism that came to predominate in the century and more following Marx's death. In an account which places a central stress on the importance of Marx's 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, and Dunayevskaya's interpretation of them, Mason singles out Dunayevskaya, in contradistinction to Trotsky, Kahlo, and Sadova, as the only figure of the four who provides the link between classic Marxism and the only form in which it can be relevant today, namely radical humanism. In Chapter 14, Frédéric Montferrand delves into the heart of Marxism and freedom, articulating Dunayevskaya's critique of state capitalism and the centrality of the notion of the unity of theory and practice that is found there. Dunayevskaya's account of the USSR as state capitalist is strongly defended by Montferrand, and on the basis of its consistent application of Marx's account of the, quote, law of value and the, quote, average necessary labor time, end quote. Montferrand also delves into Dunayevskaya's account of Marxism as a theory of liberation that calls on us to reconnect with the strategic creativity that once belonged to emancipatory movements and to supplement the question, what is to be done with that concerning where we want to go. The hope is that through this process we can take back the historical initiative that has been ceded to capital and which is waiting there for our repossession of it. In Chapter 15, Kieran Durkin explores Dunayevskaya's resurrection and repurposing of the humanism of Marxist thought, which is at the same time the essence of her own thinking. Set against the rise of the theoretical anti-humanism of Louis Althusser that came to exercise such a dominant influence in Marxian thinking, Durkin extrapolates upon Dunayevskaya's incisive account of the fundamental thematic continuities between Marx's early and late writings, a continuity which holds while refusing to reduce the latter to the former. Durkin also elaborates the ways in which Dunayevskaya goes beyond even the capacious understandings of the late Marx in the expansion of the humanist dialectic to blacks, women, and youth, and to what she came to understand toward the end of her life as a reconfigured form of what Gramsci described as, quote, absolute humanism, end quote. In Chapter 16, Kevin B. Anderson discusses Dunayevskaya's distinction between two kinds of subjectivity, which was announced first in the 1964 edition of Marxism and Freedom. Anderson's discussion here locates the origin of this distinction in Dunayevskaya's opposition to the voluntarism of Mao Zedong's, quote, revolutionary will, end quote, a form of subjectivity which she points out has no regard for objective conditions. Contrasted to this alienated form of subjectivity is the Marxist humanist subjectivity proffered by Dunayevskaya, which is rooted in the dialectical development of the ground for revolution in both its subjective and objective sense, as seen in the most creative and of the grassroots movements of the time, like the Montgomery bus boycott. Through this discussion, which also encompasses Dunayevskaya's engagement with Marx and Lenin on these themes, Anderson places the relationship between theory and practice as at the heart of the liberation struggles of the future. We hope that these essays will help a new generation to recapture and to build upon for today the writings of Raya Dunayevskaya, whose capacious humanist form of Marxism was in constant dialogue not only with the dialectical tradition of Marx and Hegel, but also with contemporary radical thinkers like Erich Fromm and Marcuse, and with the living movements of her time on the part of groups like rank-and-file labor, the black masses, and revolutionary feminists. As we have stressed, her intersectional form of Marxism can help us today to transcend the division between a class politics that sometimes tends towards class reductionism and a politics of race, gender, or sexuality that sometimes neglects the needed critique of capital. In short, Dunayevskaya offers us dialectical universals that are true, pointing to a new human society while at the same time recognizing and theorizing about the multiplicity of forces and ideas of opposition to today's alienated, exploitative social reality. And that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening. The first chapter, or the first part one of this book, which haven't quite decided whether I'm reading right away, is titled Hegel and Dialectics.